Okay, picture this. You've poured years into a public-facing role. Maybe you're a teacher, shaping young minds, perhaps a nurse on the front lines, or working for a nonprofit, serving your community. You went down this path with a clear understanding, really a significant promise, that your dedication, your public service, would eventually mean your student loans get forgiven. It's a huge incentive, right? It lets people take jobs that are vital, but, well, often don't pay as much. But what happens when the definition of public service itself, the very foundation of that promise, starts to change? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into something really important, a new development that could dramatically reshape those expectations. Executive Order 14235. This order, it came out on March 7th, 2025. It's titled Restoring Public Service Loan Forgiveness, and, well, it brings in some pretty big changes we need to unpack. So our mission today, let's break down this executive order. We want to understand its stated purpose, the specific worries it brings up, and crucially, how it plans to redefine who actually qualifies for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, PSLF.
The goal here is to make sense of these new rules and what they might mean for you. Maybe you're thinking about public service, or you're already in it, or maybe you're just curious how these policies impact all of us. This isn't just a small adjustment. It really looks like a fundamental rethink.
That's exactly right. This order, it really signifies a clear reevaluation of the PSLF program's scope. It's trying to refine who's eligible based on how the current administration sees public service and what aligns with, let's say, the national interest. It's essentially drawing new lines around what kind of work federal benefits will support, and those lines, they're going to have real consequences for people and organizations.
Okay, so before we get into those new lines, let's do a quick recap. The Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, PSLF, what was it originally all about when it first started? Many of you listening might have heard of it, maybe even based career choices on its promise.
Sure. So the PSLF program, it was set up by Congress way back in 2007. Its core purpose was pretty simple, really. Encourage talented Americans to get into and stay in certain public service jobs. The deal was attractive: work full-time in a qualifying job in government, specific nonprofits, teaching, healthcare, make 120 qualifying monthly payments. That's 10 years, right? And after that, any federal student loan debt still remaining would be forgiven. It was meant to be a strong incentive, pull dedicated people into these vital roles. It was a way to help manage significant student debt while contributing to society.
Yeah, it really was a major pathway for a lot of people. A way to serve without being totally crushed by loans. It definitely shaped career choices.
Right.
But clearly, something has shifted. This executive order doesn't just introduce new rules randomly, it lays out very specific reasons why these changes are supposedly needed. So looking at the document itself, what are the key concerns it mentions that led to this big redefinition?
Right. The order is quite direct in Section 1 about its reasoning. It lists several criticisms about how the program used to run. First, it claims that a prior administration, its words, abused the PSLF program through a waiver process. It says they used taxpayer money to forgive loans for people who are actually still years away from the statutorily required number of payments.
Wow, that's a pretty strong claim from the order. From your perspective, how common was this use of waivers, and what was the original thinking behind them? It sounds like, like it bypassed that core 10-year requirement.
Well, historically, temporary waivers were sometimes introduced. The idea was often to deal with administrative hurdles and make sure more borrowers who should qualify could actually access PSLF. Sometimes they let previously ineligible payments count towards the 120. But this executive order frames those waivers very differently as an abuse that led to forgiveness happening too soon. It essentially suggests the whole spirit of the 10-year commitment was kind of undermined, and taxpayer money wasn't spent as Congress originally intended. The order doesn't give exact numbers on the scale of this alleged abuse versus maybe just, broader program adjustments, but the claim definitely implies a significant financial issue.
Okay, beyond the waiver issue, the order also expresses this really significant concern that the PSLF program has, and I'm quoting here, misdirected tax dollars into activist organizations that not only fail to serve the public interest, but actually harm our national security and American values, sometimes through criminal means.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very serious charge. It sounds like they're framing it not just as a money thing, but as a national security issue. How does an administration even legally define or measure something like harming national security or American values when talking about nonprofits?
Yeah, that's a really critical point of interpretation. The order itself doesn't actually provide a strict legal definition in the text for harming national security and American values. Instead, what it does is suggest these harms sometimes happen through criminal means, and that phrasing kind of builds a bridge to the specific illegal activities it lists out later in the document. So while harming national security sounds broad, the way it seems to be applied here is tied directly to those explicit illegal acts that the order goes on to detail.
Okay. That helps clarify the scope a bit. The order also talks about the program creating perverse incentives. It argues these incentives can do a few things. First, maybe increase tuition costs because forgiveness looks so attractive. Second, it suggests the program might load students in low-need majors with unsustainable debt, kind of implying some eligible fields aren't really that impactful for public service. And third, it says it could push students into organizations that hide under the umbrella of a nonprofit designation and degrade our national interest. Oh no. So if the old program had these perverse incentives, how do these new specific exclusions, which we'll get to, how do they directly fix those perceived problems? Is the goal here to maybe steer students away from those low-need majors, or are these organizations seen as degrading national interest?
Yes, exactly. These new exclusions are framed as a direct attempt to correct those perverse incentives. By clearly defining and then excluding organizations involved in certain activities, the administration seems to intend to redirect the PSLF incentive itself. The thinking appears to be, if forgiveness is only available for what this order defines as truly qualifying public service, then maybe students will be less likely to get degrees or work for organizations that fall outside that narrower definition. It's definitely a strategic move, trying to align the financial carrot, so to speak, with a much more specific view of national interest and public good.
And finally, the order wraps up this section saying this whole situation needs additional federal funding to correct the negative societal effects caused by these organizations' federally subsidized wrongdoing. That's quite a line. It basically implies that the way PSLF ran before actually created problems that now cost more federal money to fix.
It does imply that, yes. It suggests that there's a financial and societal cost linked to what the order sees as the misuse of PSLF funds. Essentially, the argument from the administration is that past policy created negative results that now require more investment to fix. And that, in turn, justifies needing these new, much stricter definitions for who qualifies for public service eligibility.
Okay, so with these pretty strong concerns laid out, what is the core policy shift? What's the new benchmark, the new standard for what actually counts as public service under this order if you want loan forgiveness?
The order grounds its main directive in the president's stated duty, to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution and our national security. And it says this duty includes ending the subsidization of illegal activities. So the fundamental change, the core definition is this. Individuals employed by organizations whose activities have a substantial illegal purpose shall not be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. That's a major shift. It directly ties your eligibility to the legality and the perceived national interest of what your employer actually does.
That is a huge change. It's not just about being a nonprofit or a government agency anymore. It's about the substance of the work and whether it's seen as having this substantial illegal purpose. How can an executive order do that? Redefine such a major program? And what's the mechanism for actually making this happen?
Right, so an executive order isn't a law passed by Congress, but it acts like one for the executive branch. It tells federal agencies how to operate. In this specific case, it mandates administrative action. To make sure this new standard gets put into practice, the Secretary of Education, working together with the Secretary of the Treasury, is told to propose changes to the PSLF program regulations. Specifically, they need to update the regulation known as 34 CFR 685.219. That's the rule that basically defines eligible jobs and employers for PSLF. They have to revise it to explicitly exclude organizations involved in these newly defined types of activities.
Okay, right. This is where, as they say, the rubber meets the road. Substantial illegal purpose. It sounds a bit vague, but the order actually gets very specific, doesn't it?
Right.
What are the concrete activities listed in the order that would get an organization disqualified for PSLF? Let's break these down, maybe using clearer, everyday language, especially thinking about someone who's maybe built their career counting on PSLF.
Absolutely. The order gives a very clear list in Section 2, and these points will be the main guideposts for the Secretary of Education when they rewrite the regulations. So first up, it lists A, immigration law violations. This includes aiding or abetting violations of 8 U.S.C. 1325 or other federal immigration laws. Now, just to clarify, 8 U.S.C. 1325 is a specific federal law. It generally deals with illegal entry or presence in the United States. So basically, an organization that's found to be helping or facilitating violations of that law or similar ones would be excluded from PSLF eligibility.
So say you work at a nonprofit that provides legal help or maybe shelter to undocumented immigrants. How would they decide if that organization is aiding or abetting violations? That seems like it could get legally complicated really fast. What kind of, I don't know, due process might an organization or its employees get if they're accused of this?
That's exactly the kind of critical detail that will need to be spelled out in the new regulations. The executive order itself doesn't lay out the exact process for making that determination or what due process looks like for these organizations. We can probably guess there would need to be some kind of investigation, maybe involving different federal agencies, to figure out if an organization's actions really do count as aiding or abetting under the law. For the employees, well, this creates a lot of uncertainty, right? They might not even know their employer is being looked at until a decision is made, and that could suddenly affect their loan forgiveness plans.
Okay, next on the list is B, supporting terrorism.
Right. This covers quite a bit, including by facilitating funding to or the operations of cartels designated as foreign terrorist organizations consistent with 8 U.S.C. 1189, or by engaging in violence for the purpose of obstructing or influencing federal government policy. Just to clarify again, 8 U.S.C. 1189 is the law that sets out how groups get designated as foreign terrorist organizations. So this rule broadens the scope beyond just directly listed terrorist groups. It includes certain cartels if they're officially designated as foreign terrorist organizations, and it also includes any groups using violence to try and influence government policy.
That's obviously a very serious category. But, one could argue that many nonprofits advocate for social change, and sometimes that advocacy might be perceived as trying to influence government policy. How does this order draw the line between legitimate advocacy or protest and what it calls engaging in violence for the purpose of obstructing or influencing federal government policy?
The key difference seems to be the explicit mention of engaging in violence. Legitimate advocacy, lobbying, even peaceful protests, those are generally protected activities. This order specifically targets organizations involved in violence or those helping designated terrorist groups, including certain cartels if they fit that FTO designation. The challenge, of course, will be in the implementation, drawing really clear lines between lawful activism and actions that cross over into violent obstruction or supporting these designated groups. It could put a pretty big burden on organizations, especially during protests, to really demonstrate that their activities stay completely nonviolent.
Right. Then there's C, child abuse. This part is quite specific.
Yes, it includes the chemical and surgical castration or mutilation of children or the trafficking of children to so-called transgender sanctuary states for purposes of emancipation from their lawful parents in violation of applicable law. Now, that last phrase is really crucial here. In violation of applicable law.
Oh.
That phrase is critical. It means these actions would only disqualify an organization if they are actually found to violate existing laws. The order seems to be targeting what it defines as very specific, extreme forms of child abuse or trafficking, but only when those actions are already illegal under current state or federal laws. Without that, in violation of applicable law part, it might just be seen as expressing an opinion. With it, it grounds the exclusion in established legal rules.
That clarification, in violation of applicable law, is definitely important context. Okay, moving on. D, illegal discrimination.
Organizations engaging in a pattern of aiding and abetting illegal discrimination would also be out. This points to consistent, repeated actions that support or enable discrimination that's already unlawful. It's not about just one incident. The emphasis is on a pattern.
So, not just an accusation, but a proven ongoing practice of enabling illegal discrimination would be needed to disqualify an organization. How would they establish this pattern? And what kinds of discrimination are we talking about here? I mean, there are already lots of anti-discrimination laws.
Yeah, the pattern part suggests a higher bar than just a single mistake. It implies something systemic or repeated. This would likely need investigations and official findings, probably from agencies that handle anti-discrimination enforcement or maybe court rulings. As for the types of discrimination, the order just says illegal discrimination, so presumably it covers anything that's unlawful under existing civil rights laws, race, religion, gender, national origin, that sort of thing. Organizations would probably need to show they have strong internal policies and practices to prevent even the appearance of aiding or abetting such patterns.
Okay, and the last one is E, state tort law violations.
Yes, this final category includes organizations engaging in a pattern of violating state tort laws, including laws against trespassing, disorderly conduct, public nuisance, vandalism, and obstruction of highways. Just to quickly explain, state tort laws are basically civil laws about wrongful acts that cause harm or injury to others. This part specifically calls out repeated violations of laws related to public order and damaging property.
This seems like a very broad category, too. Things like trespassing or disorderly conduct, if they form a pattern. If I work at, say, a small local nonprofit that sometimes gets involved in advocacy, maybe rallies or demonstrations, how would they make sure they don't accidentally get caught by this? It feels like this could affect a lot of grassroots groups.
This exclusion definitely adds another layer of complexity, especially for groups involved in advocacy that might, push boundaries. For a nonprofit, being proactive would probably mean making sure they strictly follow local laws during any public event, getting permits if needed, and training staff and volunteers on what's legally acceptable during protests. That pattern language does suggest that maybe isolated incidents wouldn't trigger disqualification, but consistent, repeated violations could. It certainly creates a need for maybe more legal advice and risk assessment for smaller advocacy groups, especially if their employees are relying on PSLF.
Okay, so those 5 categories: immigration law violations, supporting terrorism, certain child abuse is illegal, patterns of illegal discrimination, and patterns of state tort law violations. Those are the explicit examples the order gives for a substantial illegal purpose. So putting it all together, what does this mean for the bigger picture? It sounds like a massive change, but how does this executive order actually slot into the existing legal and government framework? Is it like a new law?
That's a really important distinction to make. Section 3 of the order, the general provisions, helps clarify this. First, the order says it doesn't reduce the authority of any existing government department or agency. It also doesn't affect the Office of Management and Budget's role regarding budgets or legislation. So basically, it's designed to work within the current government structure, not to override it or create new unchecked powers. It's really a directive for administrative action.
Got it. So it's not bypassing how government normally works. It's an instruction to be carried out through those channels by changing the existing rules.
Exactly, and it also clearly states it will be implemented consistent with applicable law and subject to the availability of appropriations. That means it has to follow all the legal steps and depends on having the money budgeted to actually do it. And maybe most crucially for individuals, the order states it is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity by any party against the United States.
Okay, that last point sounds really important. So if you're counting on PSLF, and now maybe your employer gets excluded under these new definitions, this order itself doesn't give you a new legal right to sue the government because of this change. What are the practical implications of that no near enforceable rights for someone whose PSL eligibility gets taken away under these new rules? What can they actually do?
Well, the practical upshot is that individuals can't directly sue the government based on this executive order itself and claim they have a right to forgiveness because of it. Their recourse, their way to appeal, would typically be through the existing administrative processes that the Department of Education already has for PSLF eligibility decisions. They'd likely have to challenge how the new regulations are applied to their specific job or employer, rather than challenging the validity of the executive order itself or arguing that the regulations create some kind of personal right for them. It really underscores the administrative nature of this change.
Okay, so let's recap our deep dive today. Executive Order 14235, issued March 7, 2025. It represents a really significant move to redefine who qualifies for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. It explicitly aims to exclude organizations from PSLF if their activities are deemed to have a substantial illegal purpose. And we've broken down those specific examples, right? From immigration law violations and supporting terrorism to certain types of child abuse, if illegal, patterns of illegal discrimination, and patterns of violating state tort laws. It's definitely a comprehensive and potentially very impactful shift. So as we wrap up, what's the sort of lingering question this order leaves us with, especially for our listeners who might be navigating careers, maybe family decisions with PSLF potentially in a balance?
I think this order fundamentally forces us to re-examine that intersection between government incentives like loan forgiveness, how we define public interest, and what kinds of activities are deemed worthy of getting federal support. So for you, the listener, maybe the question is, what does this new framework suggest about how the role of public service might be evolving? And maybe what extra homework, what additional due diligence might people now need to do when considering careers in public service or working for nonprofits? How might these very specific exclusions influence not just individual career choices, but maybe even how organizations that rely on these kinds of federal benefits operate day to day?
Absolutely. It really pushes you to think beyond just an organization's mission statement, doesn't it? To really look at their actual practices and the wider legal landscape they operate in.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Executive Order 14235. It is complex, no doubt, but it's an incredibly important policy change that could touch many lives and communities. We hope we've helped you make a bit more sense of what's happening and what it might mean for your future.